Welcome to ASQA's webinar of Understanding Performance Assessment. I'm really pleased that you could join me for today's webinar. My name is Carmen Basilicata, and I'm the Executive Director of Quality Assessment and Compliance. I was appointed to this position back in September 2020, but have recently returned from maternity leave. I'd first like to begin by first acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I meet with you today. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and I acknowledge their connections to land, sea, and community, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. So today, I just wanted to give you a little bit of context to start with, and then we're going to be covering a number of different topics through a video which we would like to present to you. So as the National Vocational Education and Training Regulator, ASQA's role is to ensure quality vets so that students, employers, industry, the community and governments can have confidence in the integrity of training products issued by training providers. As most of you would be aware, on the 30th of April 2020, the Australian Federal Government released the Rapid Review into ASQA's regulatory practices and processes. The Rapid Review concluded that while ASQA's overarching vision and purpose remains appropriate, some adjustments to its practices were needed to improve its engagement and communication with the sector and ensure its regulatory approach is guided by regulatory necessity, risk, and proportionality. The report outlined 24 recommendations which form the basis of ASQA's reform agenda. Implementation of these recommendations will shift over time, ASQA's regulatory approach from prescriptive and process-based compliance to a broader focus on self-assurance by training providers and excellence in training outcomes. This will support providers to identify and rectify issues without undue regulatory intervention and to build their capacity for continuous improvement. ASQA's current reform work is part of the broader government vision for VET, as outlined in the Heads of Agreement for Skills Reform. Our reform work is designated into three key areas: governance and structure, our regulatory practice, and engagement and education. So the focus of today's webinar is on the adjustments and improvements that we have made to our structure and regulatory practice as they relate to performance assessments, so what we used to refer to as audits. In September 2020, I presented a webinar which highlighted a two-staged approach. Stage one rolled out in August 2020 when we made some adjustments to our audit practice to better align with principles of best practice regulation. These adjustments were informed by the Rapid Review recommendations and stakeholder feedback. Some of these improvements included changes to how we deal with minor deficiencies, changes to our audit reports so that they're easier to understand and make clearer links between the evidence collected and findings of non-compliance, creating better opportunities for providers to respond to issues and concerns during the audit process and prior to ASQA making any findings of non-compliance, and staged and rolled out earlier this year in April 2021. First, we separated out our audit function into two teams: quality assessment and compliance. The quality assessment team focuses on assessing a provider's performance, which is why we have moved away from describing our practice as an audit and now refer to performance assessments. If non-compliance is found once a performance assessment has been undertaken, it is a separate team. Our compliance team, who, where non-compliance is assessed, will case manage a provider's return to compliance. And where compliance can't be achieved, will make decisions relating to the appropriate regulatory response. In addition, we also consulted with the sector about our revised compliance management framework, which introduced an agreement to remedy, which provides in certain circumstances a longer period within which providers can address non-compliance on a more systemic and sustained basis. The principles which underpin our performance assessments focus on self-assurance and excellence in training outcomes. Self-assurance is about providing is about providers critically examining their own performance and student outcomes, including identifying ways to improve their performance and to ensure that they consider compliance with the standards as a core part of their business. Performance assessments are intended to test providers' systems and processes for ensuring sustained compliance, continuous improvement, and quality outcomes for students. So as part of the changes implemented in April 2021, we developed a new methodology for performance assessments against a new set of standard clauses to better support consistency in interpretation and focus more on quality and self-assurance. So the objective of today's webinar is to promote a better understanding of performance assessments. So we'll do this by walking you through what happens before a performance assessment, what happens during a performance assessment, our increased focus on continuous improvement and self-assurance, and what happens after a performance assessment. There is the opportunity to ask questions throughout the session today. I will also just remind you that we won't be able in a limited time to be able to answer all of the questions that you put to us, but certainly we will do our best to answer as many of them as we can. So we welcome your questions on performance assessment using Slido, and the event code for Slido is #performanceassessment. We have prepared a video, as I said earlier, a video presentation, which will be followed by a live Q&A session with panel members Anthony Barkey, who's a Director of Quality Assessment, and Benn Gramola, who is an Acting Director of Internal Review, who ordinarily is in the position of Director of Compliance. And they will be available to answer the questions that you pose to us today. And as I said, we'll do our absolute best to answer as many of those questions as we can. And it's this portal which will allow you to submit your questions for the panel once we watch the video presentation.
I'm one of the Directors of Quality Assessment at the Australian Skills Quality Authority, and I'm currently in ASQA's Brisbane office. Thank you for tuning in and listening to me talk to you about our risk-based regulation, the use of data intelligence to understand and respond to risks, our performance assessment approach and performance assessment preparation. So I want to talk to you about our regulatory operating model and how it is risk-based. The model allows us to ensure effective integrated management of risk, and which is critical to the successful delivery of our objectives to deliver quality training outcomes for students. The model is characterised by the effective management and use of data as a key input to our regulatory operations, and to support us to strengthen how we analyse and use our regulatory intelligence. Regulatory design activities that define a response to specific regulatory risks, and these include making greater use of behavioural insights that are coordinated and best use of regulatory tools where available across our engagement, communication and regulatory operation activities. And it also looks at strategic engagement on risks. So this includes engaging with providers by using communication, engagement and education as key tools in our Regulator toolkit. And as a fundamental driver of provider behaviour, we also share information to support providers to understand risk, including our tolerance of risk in areas of regulatory focus, and to self-assure and continuously improve. So next I'd like to talk about how we use data intelligence to understand and respond to risk. So the emphasis on engagement and co-design in our new regulatory approach means that we are strengthening our analysis of data, intelligence and feedback from the sector to identify and respond to the most significant risks to quality. And that's done through our ongoing scanning of the environment. And we also use behavioural insights to apply a balanced and proportionate response to make the best use of the tools we have in our regulatory toolkit. So whether they're engagement education activities or regulatory operational activities. And also sharing more information and increasing engagement with the sector so risks are better understood and providers can test their own governance and quality assurance practices so they continue to improve, particularly in areas of risk. So we use data intelligence to identify and respond to risks on two levels. The first is on provider risk and the second is systemic risk. I would now like to discuss with you on how to prepare for a performance assessment. It is important to note that performance assessment preparation immediately before your performance assessment is unlikely to affect the outcome significantly. ASQA's assessors will be focusing on your long-term practices and behaviours as they relate to the student learning experience. As long as you are applying sound policies and processes, preparing for a performance assessment should not be necessary. So training providers should at all times be delivering quality at each stage of the student experience and meeting the required standards. To ensure your RTO is delivering quality training assessment and meeting the required standards, we encourage you to undertake regular self-assessment, and you can use ASQA's self-assessment tool to do this. Ensure your practices and behaviours align with your documented systems and processes, and ensure you're familiar with ASQA's published performance assessment resources. So thank you for tuning in and listening to me talk to you about our risk-based regulation, the use of data intelligence to understand and respond to risk, performance assessment approach, and performance assessment preparation. I hope this has been useful, and I would also encourage you to subscribe to our Asper update newsletter for more information about the work we are doing. Thank you for joining me today.
Hi, my name's Cheryl Edwards. I'm the Assistant Director, Training and Development at ASQA. I'll be talking to you today about what happens during a performance assessment or audit process. Your first contact will be with the lead assessor, who will call you to advise you the performance assessment has commenced. The lead assessor will introduce themselves and explain the performance assessment process at a high level. They'll talk to you about a suitable date to schedule the opening meeting, tentatively schedule the interview days, and talk about the evidence that will be requested at different times throughout the process. Following the first contact, you will be sent an invitation for the opening meeting, and you'll also receive the first request for evidence, which needs to be provided 5 working days after the request date. The opening meeting is the next step of the process. The lead assessor will provide more detailed information about the performance assessment process at this time. They will advise you of the scope of the performance assessment, the clauses and standards to be reviewed, and the training products to be sampled. They will explain the performance assessment process, including when evidence will be requested, what happens during the interview days, the closing meeting, what happens following the closing meeting, when the performance assessment report will be provided, and what will happen if non-compliance has been identified. They will explain ASQA's approach to sampling. The performance assessment team will sample part of your business, with the performance assessment findings considered to be a representation of your broader operations. Just remember, it's up to you to provide evidence of your compliance. The performance assessment will focus on both your systems and demonstrated practice, with evidence obtained in a range of ways through a review of documents, interviews, and observations. The lead assessor will also ask you to talk about your operations to ensure that they have an accurate information and to get a better understanding of your organisation and your practices, and will also confirm the performance assessment details. Following the opening meeting, the lead assessor will send you an email to confirm what was discussed and request any additional evidence following the opening meeting discussions. They'll send you an email to confirm which clauses and standards will be assessed, the training products and courses to be reviewed, the date and time of the performance assessment, and whether it will be conducted via video conference or a site visit. At this time, you'll also receive the second request for evidence, which needs to be provided 10 working days after the request date. The performance assessment team will review the evidence when it's received, and following the review, you will be sent a third request for evidence. This evidence request will inform you of the units of competency, specific student enrolment records to be provided, and the specific student assessment records to be reviewed. Asking for this evidence in advance gives us a better sense of your organisation prior to conducting interviews. The performance assessment team will review the evidence when it's received. This will identify any points for discussion, any areas that require clarification, or identify any issues to be discussed during the interviews, so the performance assessment team can have informed discussions with you and your staff. The performance assessment team will then conduct the interview days. This is an opportunity to have discussions with you and your staff to ensure you have the opportunity to discuss any issues identified, enabling us to better understand your organisation. It will enable you to provide any additional evidence to demonstrate compliance that you may not have provided previously. The interviews are an opportunity to assess your performance against the relevant standards and to ensure quality outcomes are achieved for student and industry. The performance assessment team will focus on your understanding of your obligations and systems, including how you monitor, review, and improve your practices. The team will be interviewing you and your management team and current trainers and assessors, and we may interview students. We may also seek feedback from relevant industry and/or community representatives or employers. Observations will also take place at different stages throughout the performance assessment process. Observations may take different forms, for example, through a virtual tour of the premises, photographs, or tours of a training facility as part of a site visit. During the performance assessment process, the team will be considering three key questions when assessing your performance. Does your practice align with the requirements of the relevant standard? Do you have a system for ensuring ongoing compliance with the relevant standard? And do you monitor, review, and continuously improve or self-assure in order to ensure compliance with the requirements of the relevant standard on an ongoing basis? By answering these key questions, we will better understand your commitment and ability to address issues as they arise and determine your ability to remain compliant in the future. When the interviews have been completed and all relevant information has been considered, the closing meeting will be conducted. The closing meeting provides an opportunity to discuss the performance assessment progress and any issues that have been identified. You will also be advised of any minor deficiencies that have been identified. This is something new that has been established as part of ASQA's new process. Not all issues identified will be significant enough to give rise to a finding of non-compliance with a clause or standard. You will not be required to submit a response or any evidence in relation to minor deficiencies, but will be required to rectify the minor deficiencies which will be described in the performance assessment report. The closing meeting also provides an opportunity for you or your staff to ask any further questions. Following the closing meeting, the performance assessment team will continue to consider and analyse the evidence submitted and may contact you if further questions arise. 20 working days after the closing meeting, or 20 working days after additional evidence is received, you'll receive a performance assessment report. If this timeframe can't be met, the lead assessor will contact you to let you know of the delay. If any non-compliances are identified, they will be detailed in the performance assessment report, and you will have an opportunity to respond in writing with this process managed by the compliance team. So in summary, our new approach focuses on your understanding of your obligations and systems and how you monitor, review and improve your practices, and provides the opportunity for the performance assessment team to gain a better understanding of your practice and performance through ongoing review of evidence and discussion with you and your staff.
Hello, my name is James Gett and I'm one of the Assistant Directors for Engagement and Education here at Askwell. Today, what I'm going to be talking to you about is ASQA's increased focus on continuous improvement and self-assurance. So Carmen and Anthony have previously highlighted for you how ASQA has adjusted its assessment practices to focus more strongly on provider self-assurance. And to further elaborate on their points, today I'll be discussing with you the concept of self-assurance, what self-assurance looks like to RTOs complying with the standards, and what this will look like to providers who are being performance assessed. So let's start with what is self-assurance. Self-assurance is a regulatory approach used across Australia and around the world. Notably, it's used in educational settings such as early childhood, school, and vocational and higher education. The concept of self-assurance itself refers to the way providers on an ongoing basis manage their operations, identify issues and improvements, and take action to ensure that the training and assessment they provide is high quality and in accordance with training package requirements and the standards. The reason ASQA is placing a strong focus on self-assurance during performance assessment is because it allows us to gain a strong understanding of how providers are managing risk in their businesses, identifying opportunities and using those opportunities to drive quality improvements for their students, and how they are mitigating risk by addressing early any deficiencies in their compliance to limit or prevent harm to students and the sector. So, when we're talking about self-assurance, we're not talking about self-regulation or a light touch approach. We're talking about reviewing providers' self-assurance practices to gain an understanding about whether providers are demonstrating a genuine commitment and capability to deliver quality VET in accordance with VET legislative requirements. So let's talk about what do the standards say about self-assurance. So principles of self-assurance are embedded throughout the Standards of Registered Training Organisations 2015 and are found across multiple standards. However, they're most explicitly outlined in Standard 2 and more specifically Clause 2.2 of the standards. So what we'll do now is we'll have a look at Clause 2.2, we'll break it down and we'll use it as a way to discuss what self-assurance looks like for an RTO. So Clause 2.2 requires that RTOs systematically monitor their training and assessment strategies and practices to ensure ongoing compliance with Standard 1, and the RTOs systematically evaluate and use the outcomes of the evaluations to continually improve their training and assessment strategies and practices. So the three key words that we can really take away from Clause 2.2 is monitor, evaluate, and continually improve. And we'll look at these three words individually. So starting with monitoring, what does monitoring look like? So as anyone who's been involved in VET knows, developing a training and assessment strategy is the foundation for ensuring quality training is developed and is delivered in accordance with the standards and training package requirements. However, monitoring is an equally important component of ensuring that quality training is delivered on an ongoing basis. It's the process of ensuring that actual practices are in line with the strategy established by the RTO. And so what this will look like will differ significantly between providers and will be dependent on the size, scope, and modes of delivery used by the provider. So what does evaluation look like to a provider? Subclause 2.2b provides us with a really good starting point of understanding what evaluation must look like. It states that evaluation information includes, but is not limited to, quality performance indicator data collected under Clause 7.5, validation outcomes, client trainer and assessor feedback, and complaints and appeals. From this statement, we can ascertain that the provider must collect and evaluate quality performance indicator data, undertake validation and review and consider the outcomes, seek feedback from clients, trainers and assessors, and evaluate complaints and appeals to identify causes of complaints. So as before, what this will look like will differ for all providers. However, the standards give us a really good starting point in understanding what evaluation must include. So next is the third term, continuous improvement. Continuous improvement is really about taking the actions from monitoring and evaluation and using the outcomes to ensure that your risks are mitigated, that quality is ensured on an ongoing basis, and that training and assessment is continually improved. Once again, what this looks like will differ significantly based upon multiple factors, including the size of the provider and the systems they've established to implement continuous improvement. So next, let's talk about what does this mean to a provider who is being performance assessed. So during performance assessment, ASQA has many conversations. During the conversations that it has with managers and executives, it will discuss the systems they've established to monitor their training and assessment strategies and practices. how they review their complaints and appeals to identify risks, and how they're using outcomes to ensure continuous improvement. We'll also have conversations with students about feedback opportunity, complaints and appeals mechanisms, and outcomes of complaints and appeals. They'll also have conversations with trainers and assessors about feedback opportunities and how the recommendations have led to changes in the provider's practices. ASQA will also review documentary evidence demonstrating what monitoring activities the provider is undertaking, what evaluating activities the provider is undertaking, and how the applicant has used this information to improve and ensure compliance across their practices. So just in summary, as mentioned before, ASQA has shifted its performance assessment practices to focus on self-assurance, because by reviewing this information, ASQA is able to determine whether providers are identifying and fixing issues as they arise, whether they're managing risks and ensuring quality student outcomes, and whether they're committed to and capable of meeting their regulatory obligations on an ongoing basis. I'd like to say thank you very much for taking the time for listening to this presentation, and hope you're having a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hi everyone, my name's Ben Gramola, and I'm just going to quickly talk to you all today about what happens after a performance assessment. Now, my role in the organisation is I'm a Director of Compliance, and we're involved in managing providers as they return to compliance. So the questions and things that we'll be running through in this section today is, if you are compliant, what happens? If non-compliance is identified, and what are your opportunities to respond if a non-compliance is identified? So throughout this process, I must highlight that you will be communicated with from ASQA. Even after the performance assessment, you will be contacted by the person involved in the process to highlight any issues or anything that has come from the performance assessment that was undertaken. So I must be clear that we will continue to communicate with you throughout the process. It is not that once a performance assessment is over that you will just be sent a letter from ASQA. We will be in contact with you to outline the process and how we're going to deal with any issues of concern. So firstly, I'd just like to talk about if you are compliant and what that means. So at the end of a performance assessment, if you have been identified as providing quality training and in line with the standards for RTOs, you will be then contacted by your respective performance assessment officer, and as part of that, they will then communicate with you the findings of the assessment were compliant, and if there are associated applications in regards to your assessment, those applications will go through the process of approval, and if it's in relation to, for instance, adding items to your scope of registration, they will then be added to your scope of registration and processed through TGA and appear on there in the not too distant future. So now I just want to talk about, how we go and the compliance pyramid and our approach to compliance, and how, if we find that a provider does not meet the requirements of the legislation or standards, how we'll respond to that non-compliance. So in a way, we need to make sure that the response to non-compliance is proportionate to the level of risk. And that's highlighted in the diagram that we've got in front of us right now. We know almost all providers have a genuine commitment and capability to deliver compliant quality vet. And so, as you can see at the bottom level of our compliance pyramid is education and engagement, which is really those encouragement activities to direct all compliant providers on how to comply with the standards going forward, and really give them the tools and advice that assists them in determining their own business practices to ensure that they're in line with the respective standards and legislation. Where we do need to take further action, our response will be based on a number of factors, including the nature and seriousness of the non-compliance, the profile and behaviour of the provider, and other relevant matters such as information received from other government agencies, or other information held by the Australian Skills Quality Authority. So it's about using the right tools and the right approach to manage risks associated with any non-compliance that we identify. Except in most circumstances, the tools we aim to use will monitor a provider's return to compliance. So what we mean by that is we are looking to really focus on getting providers on the track to return to compliant behaviour. As I just said earlier though, that will not always be the case where we identify serious systemic non-compliance that has significant impacts on the sector, students and the community. So now I'm just going to talk about our directing compliance regulatory tools. So directing compliance is where we use regulatory tools to direct actions of providers who, although committed to delivering quality training outcomes, are not understanding of what is required or not always capable of meeting these outcomes. We use a graduated approach in directing compliance, and action taken will depend on the nature and circumstances of the non-compliance. So some of those directing regulatory tools that we use are warning letters, our new agreements to rectify, which I will talk about in a second, written directions, which may require providers to address certain non-compliances, conditions on registration, which may require providers to undertake additional measures to ensure quality, and enforceable undertakings, which may require the provider to do certain activities within a prescribed time frame to address a non-compliance that is being identified. I'd like to talk about our new regulatory tool, which is our agreements to rectify. This is a voluntary agreement and is really in the process of part of our directing compliance section of our regulatory pyramid. Now, previously providers had 20 days in which to address any non-compliance identified by ASQA. While non-compliance can often be addressed in this timeframe, sometimes significant changes are required across the organisation to implement a more systemic response. So ASQA identified that this is really where we needed to provide further time for committed providers to address areas of non-compliance. So where we can see a provider has demonstrated they are committed and capable, and the non-compliance is such that an agreement to rectify is appropriate, changes to our compliance functions may give providers the option of entering into an agreement to rectify. Again, we will not provide this in all circumstances. Where the non-compliances are significant, serious or systemic, an agreement to rectify may not be offered due to the high risk to students or the community. So agreements to rectify will allow providers to enter into an agreement to remedy any non-compliances within an agreed time period of up to 3 months. This approach encourages providers to consider their response to non-compliance in a more systemic and sustained way, supports providers to self-identify actions that will contribute to addressing the non-compliance, permits a longer period in which to make sustainable and long-term changes to systems within their own business. Accepting an agreement to rectify will mean that ASQA has confidence in the provider's ability to remedy the non-compliance within the agreed timeframe, and that the provider has been able to demonstrate a willingness to take effective actions to efficiently resolve the matters of non-compliance that are outstanding. So during an agreement to rectify, we'll continue to communicate and engage with the respective provider and to ensure that the non-compliances are addressed in an appropriate fashion going forward, and also assist them to return to compliance in a more long, substantive and effective manner. We have a broad range of regulatory tools to use when we are not confident in the provider's ability to address non-compliance voluntarily or following a direction from ASQA, or where the nature of the non-compliance is significant. We have a variety of different regulatory sanctions that we can utilise, and these are proportionate to the issues that we identify. So, for instance, we may issue a written direction to notify students of certain issues that have been identified by ASQA. We may issue infringement notices for breaches of legislative requirements. We may put in place suspensions, which again allow providers to teach out current students but not enrol future students. We may shorten a period of registration where we deem that there is a risk that is posed by a provider, and our sort of more significant measures may be that we cancel a registration either in full or part. What that means is we may remove items off a provider's scope of registration or cancel their registration altogether. Now, ASQA does not take these decisions lightly, and when we are looking at non-compliance, as I said, it's proportionate to the risks that we identify and the impacts and harm that may be caused by the non-compliances within the concerns identified with the provider. Off the back of understanding what happens after a performance assessment and the various tools that we can utilise to address non-compliance, as you see, they range across our regulatory pyramid, from education and engagement to directing compliance to sanctions to court action. Now, in regards to court action, that is where we see significant serious breaches of the legislation, and ASQA is required to take action against these providers to ensure that the community is protected against any poor behaviour from providers that has significant and severe impacts on the community or students' ability to receive quality training. So I guess from this, it's about making sure that, providers understand before a performance assessment how to prepare for a performance assessment. And look, lastly, I would like to point to a variety of different resources that we now have on our website around our regulatory practices, designed to support providers with a range of regulatory and compliance tasks. So again, I strongly encourage everyone to look at these guides and to help you understand what changes have been made in the way ASQA operates and the way in which we assess performance. So that concludes my section for today. And as always, if you require any further information, please reach out through our info line or our inquiries email, and ASQA is more than willing to provide any further information or details as required. Thank you.
Hi everyone, welcome back. I really hope that you enjoyed the video presentation. Now, before I introduce the panel who are going to assist and answer some of the questions on performance assessment today, I just wanted to raise a couple of things. So the first one is just to note that already we've received a number of questions relating to online assessment. In addition, we'll also be providing updates to our guidance that will be published by the end of the year. So just to give you a bit of an indication of timeframes regarding further information on online delivery on assessment. Also, today's webinar is being recorded and is going to be available on our website from around next week. Before I throw to the panel, I just noticed that there was a question in relation to when will performance assessment be necessary, and I just want to touch on that before I throw to Ben and Anthony. So I think you're absolutely right in kind of pointing out that performance assessment is one of the regulatory tools that is available to ASQA in performing its function as the National Vet Regulator. But it's not the only regulatory tool or activity that's available to us. So we are in fact broadening the monitoring activities that we rely on. And these monitoring activities could include phone calls, surveys, correspondence, requests for limited information. And we take a risk-based approach to determining the most appropriate and proportionate regulatory response. So this risk-based approach means that a performance assessment is not always going to be the most appropriate regulatory treatment. Risk treatment. So I just wanted to kind of point that out. I know that we'll try and keep to topic on today's webinar, but I just wanted to point out that we are in fact broadening the range of monitoring compliance activities that are available to us. So without further delay, just want to introduce Anthony Barkey. Anthony is our director, one of our directors for quality assessment. Welcome, Anthony. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Carmen. Hi, everyone. I'm Anthony Barkey, and I'm one of the directors of quality assessment.
And I would also like to introduce Benn Gramola, who is one of our directors for compliance.
Fantastic. Thanks, Carmen. And hello, everyone.
Before we kick off with some questions, just wanting to clarify that the online learning webinar is for early December and the online assessment will be available, information will be available on the website by the end of the year. So now we'll just kick off with some questions. Great. Well, we've got a number of questions here and looks like they've been voted on as well. So maybe we'll just start at the top. So the first question that I'll throw to the panel. So when you say that Asper will work with RTOs to address non-compliance, what does this look like in practice?
Well, look, and I'll also refer to Anthony to help answering this question. But look, when non-compliance is identified, and as we sort of spoke about earlier in the videos, the way in which we will work with the providers is obviously dependent on the risk in which the non-compliance is, I guess, the risk in which it poses to the sector. But what we will be trying to do is, as part of that, is communicating with the provider what the non-compliances are and how they impact the delivery and their, I guess, their compliance with the standards. Now, as part of that, we'll communicate, we'll be providing reports back to providers in relation to what the issues are, and also providing a variety of options to respond. So, you know, as I said in my video, there are opportunities to respond depending on, you know, what the non-compliances are. So we may provide an ATR or agreement to rectify, which allows providers to address more systemic, sustained, and I guess more significant issues that have been identified that they're not able to rectify in a real short period of time. So there's a variety of different tools in there that we'll do, and I guess the key part of this is that communication with the provider throughout, making sure that they're clear on what the non-compliances are and what the expectations of us as a regulator are. Anthony, did you want to add anything further to that?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of managing non-compliance, so once the compliance team has assigned a compliance officer, they will work with you to check on, for example, if an agreement to rectify has been approved. Generally, they'll allow up to 3 months for provider to either make the rectifications that are required or changes to systems and practices, and then within that 3 months be able to supply that evidence to show that those have been implemented. And the compliance officer will ask questions and look at that in terms of determining what happens next. So it could be that compliance has been achieved and is looking as though the compliance is going to be sustained, or some other risk assessment will take place.
Great, thanks so much, Ben and Anthony. Look, I might go to another question, which I think has been quite popular, and I feel like it's highly and personally relevant to me as living in Victoria, about to get out of lockdown tomorrow, which I'm very much looking forward to, which is how does COVID lockdowns and restrictions impact on performance assessments?
I'm happy to answer that one. So obviously it did throw obviously a spanner in our work. So in terms of obviously being able to visit providers on site was obviously reduced. However, also in instances where providers have been asked to provide requested information. So for example, if providers were in LGAs that were locked down and have reduced transportation. So generally in those instances, extensions were given to be able to provide those, or other mechanisms used. So for example, those who may have gone through a performance assessment already, these are currently virtually done, so by our team, Microsoft Teams. So so they're more a virtual performance assessment as we would do them if we were on site. So yeah, there's generally some of those aspects that we've incorporated to make things a bit more easier and a bit more smoother.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that, you know, that adaptation and the flexibility that ASQA's put in place over the COVID period and still current now is we have got a lot of information about that on our website as well. There are a number of flexible options available to providers during COVID-19. And, you know, it does mean that we will, you know, we still need to be an effective and efficient regulator during this period. So we, like Anthony outlined, we have been doing a lot of virtual performance assessments, and, you know, going forward, and it is important that we will, you know, as COVID and the conditions change, we'll be looking at what we can do in relation to the need for physical visitations and site visits and those sorts of things going forward.
That's great. Thank you both. And look, I might take the next question, which is, so when will performance assessments be necessary? Before renewal of registration or randomly scheduled? So I think this question kind of goes to the point that I made earlier in terms of the monitoring, compliance monitoring activities that are available to ASQA. So what are the tools in our regulatory tool belt? And we know that performance assessment is one of them. So I guess this question really goes to the heart of, well, what are some of the things that ASQA will take into account in determining whether or not a performance assessment is the appropriate regulatory activity? So some of those, essentially, as I stated earlier, we take a risk-based approach in determining what the most appropriate regulatory risk treatment will be. And just to give you a sense of the risk factors, and these are contained in our risk management framework as well. So a number of risk factors that we might consider in terms of identifying the most appropriate and proportionate regulatory risk treatment and response include consideration of high risk training products that are identified through ASQA's environmental scans, specific risks that might be identified through ASQA's intelligence or compliance information, whether there's any other current regulatory activity on foot, as well as a provider's compliance history. Now, the presence of one of these risks isn't determinative in and of itself, but really is one of a number of weighing up of various risk factors that might be present. Anthony, Ben, is there anything further that you would like to add in terms of how ASQA determines whether a performance assessment will be necessary?
Look, I guess the main thing that I'd like to outline is, you know, we work off a risk-based approach, as you said, Carmen, and it's really critical that we do utilise all the information that we have available when determining the next steps. And as you said earlier, it's not just about undertaking performance assessments. You know, our processes going forward will look at other methods to measure compliance with the standards and quality of training. So, you know, our focus won't just be on performance assessments, or in the old language, audits going forward. We're really looking at other ways in which we can evaluate and understand quality training across the sector.
Yeah, I'd just like to add that where a performance assessment has been found necessary to be able to be required, either before renewal or randomly scheduled. So we do have performance assessments that are, I guess, triggered by application. So that's where a provider is opting to add training products to its registration or for renewal of its registration. And there is also a range of provider reviews, which are technically our compliance monitoring regime. So that they're basically detected whether there's on the two risk provider in terms of provider risk or systemic risk. So so in occasions there may be some chances where we need to do randomly sampled provider reviews if the risks are there that we need to look at.
Great, thank you to you both. So I'll go to another question. So around about how long does a performance assessment generally last for? So from start to decision.
Look, and between, I think Anthony can probably highlight the first section and I can probably talk about the compliance side of things, but if you wanted to talk about performance assessment side there, Anthony.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of the performance assessment component, it varies depending on obviously what's being looked at. In terms of the size and scope of the performance assessment. But generally, as it's more of an interactive process where there's workflows where the performance assessor will work with you in terms of identifying the approach to take. So, for example, when an opening meeting is scheduled, and following that, then there's the 3 requests for information where you'll be required to provide certain evidence at specific times. And generally in between though, there's, for example, providers will have 10 working days to provide those pieces of evidence or information. And then there's a couple of a break where the assessor will review that information in order to determine the next steps. So, so that roughly is around a month or so in terms of how that process will work. And then that will go into leading into interviews. So where there's analysis of the evidence and there's further lines of inquiry that are necessary, the assessor will then schedule interviews with certain members of the RTO. So that could be with management, could be with trained assessors, and could be with students. So that's in order to follow lines of inquiry to seek more in terms of how systems have been implemented, how quality assurance has been implemented into the RTO and those sorts of things. So that can range from 1 to 3 days depending on how many staff are interviewed. And then once that's done, a closing meeting is organised, and that is to run through the findings that have been made, and it also offers the provider a chance to offer more information or to clarify things that have been discussed over the time of the interviews. And then once that's done on the closing meeting, the assessor will then write up the findings in terms of writing a performance assessment report. And that generally takes around 20 working days to do before it goes to a delegate to decide the next approach. So it's around 2 to 3 months roughly that whole workflow works.
Great, thanks Anthony. And I guess depending on the, excuse me, the outcome of the performance assessment, it might be that a decision can be made at that point in time. But correct. Potentially on but in the event that there are findings of non-compliance as a result of the performance assessment that's been undertaken, then I guess there are timeframe implications, Ben, if it ends up with our compliance teams to case manage and support providers return to compliance wherever appropriate.
Yeah, so generally what will happen is, and this is obviously risk specific and depending on the non-compliance, if it's a systemic non-compliance, it will, and significant risk to the community, that takes a different path as I highlighted in the video. But in regards to the general consensus where we've got providers that are capable and have the capacity and capability to address the non-compliances, there's generally 2 options that are provided, and one is that once the performance assessment's been done, the provider is then outlined in a letter that they may have the 2 options. One is a full written response within 20 working days, or to enter into an agreement to rectify, which is where they provide us with a plan of how they're going to actually address the non-compliances and some timeframes. Now, the timeframe on that for an agreement to rectify, the maximum for that is 3 months, because we want to make sure that providers are able to, address the non-compliances, but we don't want that to stretch out to a period where it could have further risks or impacts to students going forward. So the 3 months is where we've set that timeframe. So once a response is received or an agreement to rectify, it is evaluated by the team to determine whether the response either addresses all the non-compliances or whether there's some further issues, or B, whether the agreement to rectify addresses the non-compliances. And we aim to do that within 20 working days and get that back to the provider as quickly as possible as well. So it is a fairly quick turnaround. Obviously we want to make sure we evaluate everything appropriately, but we try and do things as quickly as we possibly can, because we understand that providers are waiting for a response and that a performance assessment is, a process that people need outcomes from quickly. So we try and do them as quickly as possible. Now, depending on what the issues are will really depend on how long the performance assessment and compliance outcomes will take.
Great, thanks, Ben. Thanks, Anthony. So look, we'll go to a question here which relates to, I guess, essentially the scope of the performance assessment. So the question is, will ASQA concentrate on specific standards in a performance assessment or assess against all of the RTO standards?
I guess I can answer that one.
Sure.
So I guess it starts from when a quality assessor starts planning for a performance assessment. So during that process, where we ask some information from the provider in terms, for example, of their data delivery, or data delivery information on, and also current numbers of enrolments and current completion rates. So that sort of allows us to look at areas that might be looking or providing risk, for example. So that allows then for the scope of the performance assessment to be planned for. So there is a performance assessment plan that gets carried out. So generally, there are some common and standard standards or clauses that are looked at. So for example, training and assessment requirements, assessment and things like that. But I guess a change in the process now that we're in performance assessment is really looking at self-assurance. So some inclusions of clauses that we are now looking at are things around how a provider is using their systems to self-assure their systems, their practices, and so forth. So those clauses around self-assurance and internal quality mechanisms will be looked at. And the other reach now is also industry engagement. So how is the provider using information that they gain from their industry engagement to improve their practices, training assessment practices? So there's some of the other additions that are commonly scoped now. And other things will also be brought in. For example, if a provider is showing some behaviours around, or ASQA's received further complaints or things like that. So there may be those particular clauses that are framed into in terms of looking at how a provider is addressing complaints and those sorts of things. So yes, there are specific standards, but on occasion we will bring in other standards and clauses if risks are there that need to be looked at.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. And just thinking about some of those April 6 changes and adjustments to our practice kind of earlier this year, it did include our performance assessment methodology, so that there was certainly a shift and greater focus on self-assurance. And as you kind of mentioned, we really, I guess, one of the key themes in our move towards self-assurance relates to governance and systems, as they provide a strong foundation to ensure that providers meet the standards for RTOs and the training package and vet accredited course requirements. And so really, I guess there is an opportunity, even through the performance assessment process, for ASQA to better understand the systems and controls that providers have in place, so that they are actually able to self-identify and treat any risks that might be present relating to the delivery of quality student outcomes. So I might go to another question, and this is essentially, I guess, really asking for some clarification around differentiating the difference, differentiating between non-compliances and minor deficiencies. So I'd love to throw that one to the panel.
Sure, I think I can start with that one, Anthony. Look, I guess the way of looking at minor deficiencies are I guess they are still in technical terms non-compliances under the standards, but what they are is things that don't impact the quality of training and don't necessarily have an impact on the outcome for the student. So for example, it may be that in a you know, and ASQA has been criticised for this in the past, what they've outlined as administrivia in relation to, you know, minor items that we identify, say, potentially with marketing material, where incorrect course codes are utilised, or, you know, there is some minor issues with policies and procedures that have been highlighted by the RTO, but they don't actually impact the quality of the training for the student or the outcomes for the student. Obviously, a non-compliance is something that we believe will impact either the student or the community, or the way in which the training is delivered, and it's not in line with, I guess, the way in which the training package was established. So it is really about making sure with those kind of non-compliances that the RTO or provider is actually able to address those non-compliances. Now, with minor deficiencies, as we've highlighted, you know, we do still expect providers to rectify those, but we won't be calling them necessarily non-compliant for that respective clause where a minor deficiency is identified. This allows providers the opportunity, you know, where they may have some minor issues that they need to fix up, we can address those in another manner that doesn't impact the, I guess, the overall compliance rating of that provider.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah,
and I guess it really does go to sort of the more systemic issues and systemic non-compliances, and that really is they're the non-compliances which might pose the greatest risk, and are therefore those of concern. But sorry, Anthony, did you want to add something there as well?
Yeah, you just talked about what I was going to add is in terms of the areas where there is they're non-systemic. Or not significant enough to warrant a finding of non-compliance. So things like Ben said, so for example, you know, if the RTO code's missing or some marketing material, for example, we may not find that non-compliant, but it's a minor deficiency, but that still gets reported as a minor deficiency for the RTO to look at once they get the performance assessment report and consider what needs to be done.
Great, thank you so much. And look, as I said earlier, we're certainly doing our best to get through as many of your questions as possible. So please make sure that you vote on a question that you're really keen to hear the response to, and would love to put it to the panel. So look, I'll take us to another question. So is there a time limit for how long ASQA will work with providers to address non-compliance? And Ben, I think this kind of might be in the compliance case management space, so I might throw to you.
Sure, thanks, Carmen. Look, a time limit is probably, like, I couldn't define it as, you know, 20 days or a time period. It really does have to do with what the non-compliances are. You know, as I said earlier, there's opportunities where we will work with providers, you know, through agreements to rectify, opportunities to provide responses, those sorts of things. Where it is clear, systemic, and probably more, how would I put it, more direct non-compliance, where we see there's issues with providers, you know, and we understand that it's not, you know, that they don't have the capability, capacity, or the willingness to become compliant, the time in which we will work with a provider will vary. So where we see capability, willingness, and capacity to address non-compliances, we will work with the provider as much as we can. However, we do have limitations on what we do, and like I said, that's where our timeframes for things like agreements to rectify. We believe a 3-month period is sufficient for a provider to be able to address any non-compliances, and on top of that, we also give providers, you know, 20 days to provide a written response if they don't want to enter into an agreement to rectify. Now, once we've received those, we will consider the options and what the next processes are, and keep the provider involved in that process as we go along. So they are clear on what timeframes are available for them. But again, I guess this question goes back to what is the actual non-compliance that we are trying to address in the first place will depend on whether how much, I guess, time that ASQA will provide for the specific provider to address the response. Because if it is systemic, if it is got a significant risk, the risk to the community is quite high. And as a regulator, we want to make sure that these risks are addressed very quickly. However, if it's something, like I said, where we believe they are capable of addressing the risk, we will work with that provider for a reasonable period of time to allow them to address those non-compliances and return to compliance.
That's great. Thanks, Ben. So Anthony, look, the next question I might kind of start with you. So will performance assessment guidance notes, general timeframes and information be published on the ASQA website?
Yes, currently, I think even as of today, the sections around performance assessment on our website have been updated. So I think that might go live today. So that sort of steps out the performance assessment structure, I guess. And there are practice guides as well that have been published that providers can reference to get more information from that.
That's great, thank you. I think we'll try and see if we can squeeze in maybe a few more questions. So in the past, audits have been undertaken purely as a desktop review. There's been no verbal communication with the provider. Is this going to be the case moving forward?
Look, I think, obviously prior to COVID, the majority of our actual assessments were done on site, and COVID obviously saw a change in that. ASQA had to adjust to that change during that period, and we've learned a lot of lessons in relation to this environment, as I'm sure others have. And look, we have improved our communication processes. So as part of and it is part of the guidance and that is published on our website, talks about how much we will communicate with you. So right at the initial stages, as was highlighted in the video, you will be contacted by the performance assessor that will be involved in undertaking the assessment. And throughout the whole process, you'll be communicated with ASQA so that you're clear and have an understanding of exactly where your performance assessment is at, what the non-compliances are, and what other concerns ASQA may have. And if you are compliant and we get through that process and it's all finalised, you'll be given all the information around what the next steps are in that process as well. So, if there's applications that are attached to the performance assessment, when they'll be granted, and when you'll see items updated on your scope of registration. So yes, we have taken note of that feedback from the sector regarding communication. And like I said, it's not just a matter of you will receive a letter from ASQA, we will do the performance assessment and then you will receive another letter with the outcome. That won't be the case at all. You will be contacted at the start of the process, during the process, and at the conclusion of the process.
Right, thanks. And Anthony, I might just ask you a quick question. So in your role as the Director of quality assessment, is it your expectation that our quality assessors would pick up the phone and speak to providers and introduce themselves and kind of talk them through the performance assessment as it kind of goes through its course?
Absolutely, and there's various touch points across the performance assessment workflow, basically. So right from the time that the quality assessor contacts the provider, let them know that a performance assessment is going to be underway. From that process on step forward, the process is there are touch points or communication points with the provider along the way. So there shouldn't be any surprises, I guess. So it's a very open, transparent process, even leading up to interviews. If there's questions the provider has before those interviews, that they can contact the quality assessor to ask information and so forth. So yeah, there shouldn't be any reason why an RTO is not communicated with throughout the process.
That's great, thanks. Hey, Ben, I might throw the next question to you, given your acting role in the Director Internal Review, as well as your experience in the compliance space as well. So what options are available if a provider is unhappy with the final outcome of a performance assessment?
Sure. So there's a variety of options available. Obviously, once a performance assessment is undertaken, if there are, if an RTO is not happy with a decision, they have the opportunity of requesting a reconsideration or internal review. So as part of that process, it does allow the provider to supply additional evidence, and there's an application that you complete on our website, and you can also do that through the portal as well. And as part of that, it's outlining, what you've identified as your concerns. Obviously, if there are concerns around the conduct of the assessment, we do obviously, or the conduct of the assessor, we have a complaints process, which is also available on our website. But generally, like I said, there's lots of opportunities where if there are defined issues with either the performance assessment outcomes or the performance assessment in general, for providers to actually engage with ASQA to outline their concerns and provide further evidence. You know, we note that a lot of providers are able to, as part of after the assessment process, provide additional evidence. And by working with a number of providers, we have been able to work to a process where they have been able to come compliant after that process. And you know, that is ASQA's aim, is we're, like I said earlier, where providers are showing a willingness and capacity and capability, we really do want to work with those providers to see what we can to return them to compliance.
Right, thank you, Ben. So look, the next question kind of touches on ASQA's risk-based approach, which we kind of did talk about a little earlier. So just wondering if you could both provide some more detail around ASQA's risk criteria and the differences in practice between low risk and high risk providers.
I'll let you start off with this one,
Sure.
Anthony.
So there's various factors that we gather in terms of our intelligence gathering, the use of our own regulatory data. We also use things like external data. So, for example, information gained from the total vet activity data that we can get access to. We also receive information from other partner agencies, so through our sharing agreements with Commonwealth, state and territory funding bodies, and broader engagement with the sector, so through our stakeholder liaison group and provider roundtables and other industry forums. So all these mechanisms allow us to run risk assessments, or in terms of where there's areas or flags that are raising, that identify that ASQA may need to do some risk mitigation, for example. So in terms of low risk and high risk, it really depends on the intelligence that we have, or the compliance posture of the provider throughout its registration cycle. So there's various other risk criteria. For example, complaints and tip-offs about provider performance. So that might trigger some sort of risk assessment to be done to ascertain whether a performance assessment is required, or some other regulatory tool. So, for example, it might be just a letter or a warning letter, or it might be an education campaign where there's a number of providers that are showing a risk in a particular area. Or it could come down to where there's a systemic risk. For example, if it's sector-wide or to a particular industry area, we may look at doing strategic reviews. So, for example, we're doing the online training as a strategic review at the moment. So there's various risks that trigger different regulatory approaches that we may take.
Thanks, Anthony. And look, the only other thing that I'd highlight, and it was as part of the video presentations, was, I guess, if you look at our compliance pyramid, it really does talk about, if you look at our proportionate response to risk, that really details how we consider risks. So, you know, it's one, what is the actual and potential harm of the issues that we've identified with a provider? And secondly is the level, like I said, of capacity and capability of the provider to address those non-compliances. So that's, I guess, in the practical sense of how we look at risk once we've identified it. But as Anthony said earlier, it is about us collating information from a variety of sources to determine, one, where risks are across the sector, and then drilling that down all the way into where risks may be in relation to specific providers.
Great, thank you so much. And I guess kind of flowing on from that, in some of the data and information that might be taken into account in kind of determining risk assessment, and then risk factors to be taken into account. So does historical data affect the current performance assessment?
Look,
not
yeah,
necessarily. Sorry.
No, you go, Anthony. This sits more in your realm.
Yeah, not necessarily, but what will happen is, or what does happen is, those sort of things are looked as part of the performance assessment planning and research stage. So, for example, if a provider previously underwent an audit, and there was a written direction, for example, issued as part of that outcome, then if a future performance assessment is looked at, the assessor will look to see if that written direction is being complied with, for example. However, the purpose of the performance assessment is to test your systems and your practices as they are today. So it's really a fresh look to determine whether you're meeting the compliance with the standards and clauses as of today or whenever your performance assessment is undertaken.
Start off with the next question and then throw to the panel and see whether or not you've got anything in addition to add. So one of the questions that's been put forward is, will the performance assessment contact person, so for us that's the quality assessor, be the case manager between ASQA and the provider thereafter? So I guess the question there is, will the quality assessor be the same person to compliance, be responsible for compliance case management? And the answer to that is no. So in April of this year, we did separate out our functions for performance assessment and compliance. And so our quality assessors, in terms of their role and responsibilities, it is quite confined to really assessing a provider's performance. And as I said, they can do that in a number of different ways. One of the regulatory tools and activities that's available to assess performance is a performance assessment. But that's really where the involvement, if you like, of the quality assessor ends. And I guess when we think about best practice regulation and our good administrative law principles and the importance of ensuring transparency and I guess really avoiding not only real but also perceived bias, it is important in adhering to those principles that we do have kind of the separating out of those functions, but also to ensure that as part of the compliance case management process, there are fresh eyes that are also looking on and analysing the evidence as well. The ultimate aim for the regulator is to reach evidence-based decisions and ensure that the correct and preferable decision is being made. So there's certainly measures in place as that, and our role and responsibility as the regulator, which really support best practice regulation and really underpin a lot of the changes that we've made over the last 6 to 18 months. So maybe we'll go through to another question. We've got a little bit more time left before we do a quick wrap up. So one of the questions, I think it is quite similar, it just relates to site assessments being conducted or whether all performance assessments are conducted via desktop. So I might throw that one through to the panel to clarify whether site assessments will happen sort of moving forward or whether we anticipate that they will be desktop.
I'm happy to answer that one. So at this stage where current restrictions restrict us from obviously travelling around. So I think it's important to remember that the performance assessment process now really is looking strongly more at, the systems and processes that have been implemented. So a lot of the information and evidence that's provided up front will determine whether there is a on-site component. So previously, most will be familiar with an audit was conducted solely on site. So that was the whole start to finish. With performance assessments, majority of the work is done upfront in terms of the evidence that's provided as a desk review. the determined lines of inquiry and those sorts of things to be asked during interviews. Now, it could be if there's other observations that need to happen as part of evidence gathering. So those observations could include looking at facilities, you know, and those sorts of things where an on-site component may be required as part of that performance assessment as an evidence gathering technique. So, so not necessarily every time there will be an on-site component, but it'll be only in those areas where an assessor needs to visit to look at things, inspect things, or even if there's a requirement to interview students, for example. So it just depends on the evidence that's been collected as part of through the performance assessment process.
Great, thanks, Anthony. So how does ASQA identify non-compliances, and at what stage will the provider, and I guess what stage of the performance assessment will the provider be informed?
Look, well, there's a few aspects in which that'll occur. So obviously, as part of the initial performance assessments, which is undertaken by an assessor within sort of Anthony's remit, there will be, you know, they will speak to the provider as part of that process and as part of the wrapping up of the assessment process. Now, if there, like I said, if there are non-compliances and they are identified, there will be that interaction with the provider so that they have a clear understanding. Also, in many circumstances, as the assessor is going through the process with the provider, they'll be highlighting areas of concern that they've identified so that it is clear, so that we don't want to work on a surprise basis that people, you know, get a report and there's, you know, things in there that they are not aware of or weren't made aware of as part of their report. Now, obviously, a lot of that is dependent on the evidence that's provided, the way in which the provider engages with us as the regulator, and the information that we receive throughout the process regarding that specific provider. So we will try and, like I said earlier, we will communicate, and it is really clear to everybody so that they understand where we are, you know, what our concerns are and the ways in which they address them. Now, when it comes across to compliance or within my remit, when we're looking at responses or agreements to rectify, as part of that, we will highlight any areas there that we've identified as well. We will do an assessment of the evidence that's been provided, review that, and then provide an outcome to the respective provider. And they will be contacted about what that outcome is and what the issues surrounding those non-compliances may be.
Look, can I just say, on behalf of ASQA, we're incredibly grateful that you've taken time out of your day to learn more and develop a better understanding about performance assessments and also the flow-on compliance activity that may or may not follow. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, and a special thank you to our panelists, Anthony and Ben. Thank you so much for providing some really solid and informative, helpful answers, I think, to all of our attendees. Again, just a quick reminder that this webinar is going to be published and available on our website, hopefully at some stage next week. We've got a number of methods that you can contact us. Obviously, we've got our website, ASQA's Twitter account, LinkedIn, and of course, if you haven't already, please sign up for our monthly newsletter, which you can do through our main webpage on asqa.gov.au. I'd just like to give a big shout out to all of the people who have contributed to today's webinar, including Cheryl and James as well. So thank you to everyone also behind the scenes. Please continue to subscribe to our webinar sessions, and we will be asking you to complete some questions at the end. We are a continuously improving organisation, and we do value your feedback. So if you could take the time to provide us with that feedback, we'd be most grateful, and we'll certainly take all of it into account in preparing for the next one. So thanks again, everyone.